I am here with Christopher Sandbatch, writer of Esoteric Americana on Substack, a frequent guest on Myths of the 20th Century, and a proud member of the Spreadsheet Race. Christopher, thank you very much for coming here.
Oh, how's it going? It's good to be here, actually. I would like to begin because this is going to become relevant for a number of esoteric reasons. I would like to wish everybody. Of course, we're recording, and so it's going to come out later. But today is Carolina Day in the South, which is for those of us. Well, it's Carolina Day in the Carolinas, but the entire South is Carolina. And today is the day that South Carolina celebrates the victory of Colonel William Moultrie in the American Revolution, and it's kind of a big deal. Like, they'll have like all the the Christians. They'll go down to the big churches in Charleston. And they'll say a solemn high mass, and sing the state song. They all wear seersucker and then go to brunch. It's one of the cooler sort of weird American holidays that's out there.
This is exactly what I want. I want the weird stuff, right, and I want the cool stuff. I'm inviting Sandbatch over here to open up the fire hydrant of red pills and blast them right into my huge white head. And there was a quote.
The reason it's relevant though is because it's my abiding love for South Carolina, and one particular person from South Carolina by the name of John C. Calhoun, who was a senator there and for most of the early half of the 19th century, whose burning hatred for Andrew Jackson animated most of his life, and so and as the future avatar of John C. Calhoun, I'm continuing the very personal battle against Andrew Jackson, forward into eternity.
We're getting right into Andrew Jackson. I like it because I want to talk Andrew Jackson with you, but I also wanted to quote you very, very quickly. You posted something on your Telegram, Esoterica Americana, also on Telegram, and you posted this little screenshot, and you had written, "When people ask me what Esoterica Americana is," and I just want to read it to give people some insight because I liked this. I liked reading this. So here's the quote. I'm going to read. "The fall of Albion included a deluge in which the center of Atlantis was overwhelmed and only the fragments of the British Isles were left. The settlement of America by the English and revolt of America against the dead hand of English tyranny is therefore the dawn of a new age in which Atlantis begins to appear above the waves." I like that. That got me riled. I'm worked up into a lather reading that. I like it.
I don't know what it means, but yeah, let's do some more of that.
It sounds like Esoteric Americana is what it sounds like to me.
Yeah, when I ran across that, I thought it was something from like you think of like BioShock, like the 1890s, nativists, or like some character that Daniel Day-Lewis is going to play in a movie someday. But the guy that wrote that, he's some hippie from like Portland or somewhere like that. He wrote that book in the 1970s. I was like,
hippies they used to knock some whoppers out of the park, those hippies, every so often. Maybe it's just, acid is right twice a day. But yeah, some of the weirder hippies come up with cool stuff like that. And one thing, did you want to talk about Andrew Jackson right off the bat? Because I know you're big in Andrew Jackson. Because really, one of the main reasons whenever I read your Telegram, you always got a good take. Whatever it is, you got a little spin, you got a twist. And I always love going in there because I have a keen interest in American history. And we covered some American history here on the show very, very loosely. We covered, as some people might remember, we covered all the Cold War stuff, covered all the World War II stuff. But then we got into Albion Seed, about the settlement of America. And then we also discussed American nations, similarly done. But that deep history, going further back, pre-World War I, all that stuff, Civil War stuff. I find that fascinating. And I think, I think you might believe this as well. A lot of people get it wrong. A lot of people, once you go back into American history, there's a lot of fertile soil for stories and cool shit. But I bet there's a lot of misconceptions. Is that something you would agree with?
Well, this is a thing with history. It's like the parallax effect of history. I just made that up right now. I don't know if that's a thing, but the
You know, I'm going to tell people it was a thing, and it is a thing.
right, the further back in time, really, actually, it's not even the further back in time. You can kind of draw a line, and it's like when there are no longer any living people under retirement age, then that were there and can remember it without it being questioned as like being like some sort of the delirious rantings of an old man. Then history it becomes more fantastic, and really the further back in time you go, the more fantastical it gets, because the spaces between what is known gets wider, and so there's more room for you to sort of file in and fill in missing spaces with your own concepts of what of what actually happened. And really, American history, anything before the Civil War is, it. There's a almost have to make a separate category. Is this history, or is this ideology be using history as a vessel? And the vast majority of it, including literally everything you learned, especially when if you're an American and you went to public school, or even if you went to a not great private school, or maybe even if you went to a great private school, everything you learned about American history is it's nonsense. It's not the way it actually happened. Even whenever the facts are presented as they actually happened, the commentary on it is usually wobbly at best.
Well, I can speak to that, having a Canadian education. I don't know how accurate what we were taught about America is. Like, for the stuff we were taught, I can name a bunch off the top of my head. Abraham Lincoln invented black people. I don't know if that's true or not. I'm starting to suspect it's not. The famous armistice between the North and the South during the Civil War, where they met in the middle and had all of that orgy, and that's where Indians come from. That could not be true. I just don't know. And I guess that's why you're here to.
Well, I've got one. I've got one for you on Canadians specifically, and the American Civil War specifically. First of all, let me ask you this. First of all, do you know which side the Canadian government favored during the American Civil War?
You're just saying this in a way it's going to be like, I think it's one way, what's another. I'm going to say the South. Am I right?
Yeah, and it wasn't even close. Like they were incredibly celebratory every time the United States, because the Canadians were afraid that America was gonna, because we've done it. Okay, we've done it twice. Actually, we've invaded Canada twice. They thought we were going to do it again, and so at the time, the United States and Canada were antagonists.
Well, that was a funny thing, because just so you know, in Canada, a popular thing every basic bitch Canadian will bring up. It's like, oh, did you know that we burned down their White House in the War of 1812? And I'm like, did they might have done something back to it? Do you think they did? But to them, it's just like the story they're taught in school is Canada kicked America's ass, and America has been jealous since.
Well, there's some truth to it. I mean, there's some truth to it. Canada is the only country that has ever successfully repelled an American invasion more than once. And that's, wait, but hold on, before I lose this thread, Canada and the American Civil War, I was talking to another content creator, actually Dave the Distributist, the other day, and you had some Canadians visiting him, and they wanted to go see the Gettysburg battleground, and he was talking about that. He was like, out here with these Canadians, they've wanted to go see the Gettysburg battlefield, but they didn't know why the Civil War was fought or anything like that. They just wanted to go see, like, whoa, we want to see the Gettysburg battlefield.
Yeah, well, Canadians abroad are functionally Chinese people. Like, we go because we've heard of it. Eiffel Tower, I don't know in the context of what that is. I just know I've heard of it. So Canadians they're a funny race of people.
I think so. But yeah, no, that's the Canadian. But this is the general thing about history, though. Because really, what we're going to talk about today, this is where the revision is because history, the story will change every 20 years or so as well. So this is one of these things where the story that I want to talk about mostly today, with as many interjections as we need, to do,
Yes.
what all the other stuff that we need to do, is the story of Andrew Jackson and the bank wars. Now, what's the Canadian take on Andrew Jackson and the bank wars? I don't what do you know about this
I
situation?
don't think there is a Canadian take. If there is a Canadian take, I think it would follow the internet's take, which is like the cracked.com or 4chan take, which is, oh, Andrew Jackson was the quintessential American. He hated banks and he was. I've read myself about Andrew Jackson, so I might have a slightly more detailed one, but I think they
Right.
think of him like they think of Teddy Roosevelt, like, oh, he's a cool guy and he yells and here's some anecdotes about him. That's probably about it.
Well, see, this is one of these things where, like, that's a take that's correct to call it the internet take, because that's what the internet do. If you go to a university, sit through an American history course, they're going to tell the story a little bit closer to the way I tell it. And if you go to a high school history class, they're not even going to tell the story at all. They're just going to mention that something happened between we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal and Juneteenth, and that's the way it goes. But every 20 years or so, the story changes wildly. So it's also difficult to keep track in your head of which version of this story is being told. So, like libertarians, for instance, I was in a conversation with a bunch of libertarians last night. And they were like, well, we can't, they were trying to come up with an avatar for something. They're like, well, we can't use Andrew Jackson. So who is Andrew Jackson's vice president? We got Martin Van Buren. We'll use him. And then somebody brought up a Ludwig von Mises story. And it said, Martin Van Buren is the greatest president in American history. And I'm like, Martin Van Buren is the worst president in American history. So it's like, the way the heuristic usually works is, whatever the libertarians believe, you could pretty safely believe the opposite, and you might be right, but in all of this political wrangling, I think the thing that gets lost is how entertaining the characters in American history are. So take this for instance. This is a story where we quite literally have at one point elected, the United States government. Okay, first of all, it's virtually impossible to conceive today of the American government discussing banking policy, because it's hard to imagine anybody in the American government today, understanding banking policy. But in the rarefied air of the early 19th century, it was not only possible to have the American government discussing banking policy, it was possible for drunken brawls to break out on the floor of the House of Representatives about banking policy. And if that doesn't get your, well, you're not an American, but if that doesn't get your, your blood flowing as a red-blooded American man on the cusp of the second white boy summer, I don't know what does.
Well, no, to be fair, like there are stories that circulate in Canadian politics of around the same time, going back in history, like Sir John A. Macdonald, the first Prime Minister of Canada. He was a notorious fall down drunk. So, we love up here stories of like drunk leaders just doing hilarious shit, and like wandered in the woods and came back with a bunch of meat and no one knows why. Like there's a lot of that going on.
Right. Yeah, no, there's quite a bit of that. And so just to set the scene here a little bit, this is the early 19th century, during a period of time this is the end of a period of time that's referred to as the era of good feelings, and the beginning of a time that people will refer to as the Jacksonian era. And before we get much further into it, I do want to plug some reading that people can do, because inevitably somebody's going to find me and say, will you give me a list of, I know exactly who it's going to be too. They're going to find me and say, can you give me a list of books that I could read about this topic that, would flesh it out some. So the three I'm going to suggest are H.W. Brands' great book. It's called The Great Triumvirate, which is not really about Andrew Jackson, but it's about the three senators that essentially ran the country from 1812 to about 1850. One of them was John C. Calhoun. One of them was Henry Clay, who is going to figure into the story today. And the other one is Daniel Webster. The second book that I would recommend is actually one that was written by a professor of mine called Andrew Jackson. It's called The Passions of Andrew Jackson, and that's going to be written by Andrew Burstein, Burstein, a man who describes himself as a liberal elitist New York Jew, but he is brilliant. And actually, despite not liking Andrew Jackson, he's got a real sympathetic take. And then the last one is the Arthur Schlesinger book that is like the foundation text in America on Andrew Jackson, and that one is called The Age of Jackson. So if you want reading suggestions for the end of this, those are the three I'm going to tell you over and over again, unless you give me a really specific request.
No, first of all, that's very, very good. Thank you. Before we start, is there a relationship between Andrew Jackson and the city of Jackson Hole?
I think it's probably named after him. There are like Jackson, Tennessee is definitely named after him. Jackson, Mississippi is named after him. Jackson, just about anywhere east of the Mississippi River is definitely named after him. Jackson, Wyoming, I think probably is, but I couldn't tell you for sure.
If there is a thing named at Jackson, odds are it's named after him, I think. Sorry, before we go off, actually, I'll say this to later. I was going to ask if like people are coming after Jackson to rename it, but we can talk about that later or something.
Yeah, they are. Well, okay, yeah, everybody's got a reason to hate him. He's one of these people that, because the only downside to this not being a live stream is that we can't see people we literally can't see people like dunking on one another in the comments about out and though in this scene it's usually going to be people like climbing over themselves to get a better angle to suck his dick from, but that just be how it is. But he's one of the most controversial people in America. There was briefly a movement to move him because he's on our $20 bill. And there was a movement to get him off the $20 bill and replace it with Harriet Tubman. But I think that was just so jokey it fell through. Like everybody's like, put Harriet Tubman. Harriet Tubman, by the way, I don't know if you know who Harriet Tubman is. The Underground Railroad. She wasn't even a real person. Just literally not even real.
Yeah, I got a lot of Helen Keller vibes, and like something's off about this whole thing that no one ever questions. Like Harriet Tubman sounds like some kind of mirage.
Yeah, no, there's no attestation whatsoever that this was a real woman, and there's like some thoughts that maybe she was a man that was retconned later as a woman, and so the only people who care about her at all anymore are queer theorists because they can't decide if it's a trans or if it's a lesbian or and that's the sad fate of the Harriet Tubman and why she will never make it on the $20 bill.
Gay simulacra and living in the past projected there.
Right. Well, and anyway, the standard story of Andrew Jackson, I think, and some of this stuff is true. He the thing people think of him as is the man who killed the Bank of the United States, and
yes,
that's probably the most consequential thing he did. And actually, really, these events, in my opinion, as a toot my own horn, toot as a scholar of American history, is probably the second or third most important or consequential event in American history after the Civil War itself and maybe the Revolution. That's how actually ultimately important this question of the bank, and not the question of the bank itself, the question of how Americans remember the story of the bank. Because I don't know if you're aware of this, but this idea of the anti-banking position in American politics is generally referred to as the populist position, and especially for the last 5 years, 50 years or so, really since World War II, the American right has positioned itself as the heirs apparent of Andrew Jackson's anti-banking tradition. But there are some important things that they've gotten wrong here. Okay. Which is that, yeah, Andrew Jackson does successfully get rid of the Bank of the United States, but really, what was the Bank of the United States there to do, and what were the consequences of getting rid of it? Like, were those are the is it was it ultimately pro or anti banker to get rid of the national bank? And perhaps if it is, and if it was anti, if that question is too hard to answer, was it pro American banks to get rid of the Bank of the United States, or was it pro Brit, or was it, or maybe it was pro British banks to get rid of the Bank of the United States? And if that's the answer to the question, okay, he yeets the American banks, and so now the British banks, are in charge. Well, all of a
Yeah,
sudden, then
it opens the door to all sorts of foreign interests, conceivably.
right. He goes from being the anti-banking hero of American history to maybe should have been strung up for treason. You, like depending on your positionality.
Just to add to that, if I may, so I've seen this come up in a few. I think you might mention this and some others, where really questioning this anti-bank position, especially anti-central bank, because on the right, broadly speaking, people are anti-central bank because central bank =sign Rothschild. But then a lot of these people tend to also be national socialists. They tend to be various shades of fascist. So you would say, well, conceivably, in your ideal model, would there be space for a central bank or some kind of nationalized bank system? And they would probably say yes. So really, the bank question has never really been unpacked a lot on the right, at least in my experience. But it seems kind of obvious that, yeah.
I was doing a show many years ago with a guy by the name of Geert Marco de Wit, and he was a student of Hans Hermann Hoppe, who was he was a Dutch character who was living in Finland at the time. And he actually, I think, maybe an elected official there now, but he made the comment to me, and he's a libertarian, like frames himself as a libertarian, and he made the comment to me that really set me down the path to where we are today, which was that if you want a libertarian state, the first thing you have to do is establish a national bank. Now, that
Yeah.
seemed incongruent to me at the time because I was like 23 or whatever, and like maybe not quite a libertarian, but I was still far more sympathetic to that. But it has slowly revealed itself to me over time, and this story, I think, is the best one that sort of explains why, because we could really get everybody kind of knows the first bank, the story of the first bank, which is that Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson strike a deal at dinner, so Washington D.C. gets put in the South, and Hamilton gets his bank. The federal government assumes the debt of the states and establishes credit that funds the United States government, which they use excise taxes and tariffs to pay, to service the debt on, and thus establish the United States as a credible, sovereign player in the world. The second bank's a little more complicated, just because the government is significantly more sophisticated. There are a lot more states involved. There are a lot more moving pieces. But, and this is one of the things with history is it's always very difficult to decide where you should start telling the story. You were talking before we were recording, you were talking about how everything spider webs on you if you're not careful. In this instance, I want to start in the year 1832. So there's a couple of interesting things that happen in the year 1832. It's a presidential election year. And this is the first presidential election in which the majority of states have universal white suffrage. Okay, so this is the first time in many states. There's a couple that still don't at this point. South Carolina hasn't had. South Carolina still doesn't allow white men to vote. I don't think Jamie might pull that one up and call me out on it. I might have gotten that wrong. But in general, this is the first election in which universal white suffrage is a thing. It is also the first election in which the party system as we think of it today exists. So like this is the first time there's a national convention. And the reason this is the first time there's a national convention is because in the previous election, John C. Calhoun through a very strange set of circumstances, becomes the vice president he becomes the only American vice president to be the vice president for two successive presidents. So he was the vice president under John Quincy Adams, and then he becomes, through this weird trick, becomes the vice president under Andrew Jackson. And these two men did not get along at all. Okay, Jackson and Calhoun is from South Carolina. He gets involved in something called the nullification crisis over something called the Tariff of Abominations, which they're not just terribly important for our purposes right now, but it culminates with Andrew Jackson threatening to arrest Calhoun if he returns to Washington, D.C. from South Carolina. And later that year, during the election, Jackson wins against another one of these characters that's from the Great Triumvirate, Henry Clay, who was running on the ticket of a party that was called the National Republicans at the time. And the National Republican Party dissolves in 1834, but it recoalesces under the name Whig for the next election. So whenever you're thinking of, if you're familiar with that term from American history, Clay, think of Clay as the Whig and Jackson as the Democrats, even though actually both of these groups of people referred to themselves as the Republicans in various times. But the way this works is that Jackson, because of the expanded franchise, he has, and this is a strange American tendency to elect military leaders that may not have any qualification for service except that they killed a bunch of Indians somewhere. And this is the case with him, but Jackson is wildly popular during his first term, and mostly because of his policy of enfranchisement. He wins, I think, all of the southern states. 75 electoral votes in 75 electoral votes in the South, and then the largest state in the Union at the time was New York, which had something like 45 electoral votes, which I think is more than it has now. And suffice to say, he wins in a landslide. And the first thing that's on his books to do during his second term is to end the Second Bank of the United States, which at the time in 1832 still has several more years left on its charter. So the bank was chartered for X number of years, and for a number of years now there have been increasing friction in the national government, and especially at the state level, to revoke the charter of the Bank of the United States. Now, why? Okay, there are a couple of different factions in play here that are worth laying out, because they'll lay the groundwork for this story a little bit better. The first faction that I think is worth pointing out is the Democrat Party itself, the Democratic Republican Party. I'm going to call them the Democrats, but they referred to themselves as the Republicans. In the 1832 election, they win 143 seats in the House of Representatives, which gives them a commanding lead. It is a party that is composed primarily of, in the South, of planters and freeholders who are. I did a Substack article on what the difference between a planter and a freeholder is, and I'll probably publish it on I'll boost it on Telegram and probably tweet it or whatever so people can read. But these are sort of you would think of them as middle class farmers, and they're the interior farmers as well. They're not on the coast, and they're mostly engaged in growing cotton. This becomes important because the primary market for cotton is in the United Kingdom, not in the United States. The Northern Democrats are concentrated heavily in the city of New York City, and they are generally appendages of this growing conveyor belt that's funneling cotton. On one hand, it's funneling cotton into the textile mills of the United Kingdom, and on the other hand, coming back the other way, capital goods, expensive things like horse carriages, industrial machinery that are being produced in the United Kingdom are being loaded on the same ships that brought the cotton in, and they're being funneled back into New York City. And so this is the cotton factor, cotton planter, New York financier. They call them Knickerbockers or wildcatters is what they would refer to them. That's the Democrat ruling coalition. Okay, the National Republicans, which is at this point, it's the remnants of what had been the Federalists. They are composed of, in Louisiana, the most interesting faction of them is the Louisiana sugar planters. In South Carolina and along the eastern seaboard in the South, they tend to be the coastal elite. These are the very wealthy planters that own 500-600 slaves instead of like 2 or 3 slaves that help them do the work. They have large moats between them and financial insecurity, they're not the main thing that separates them is they're not spending the money. They're not putting the money that they made this year up as collateral to get a loan to plant their crops the next year. Okay. That's really kind of if you can do that, you're probably a Whig. Then there's another party called in the extreme Northeast, the National Republicans are the old Federalists, the Yankees, the Puritans. Then it's probably worth pointing out that the National Republicans, before we get into the weird little parties, the National Republicans in 1832, they ran Henry Clay as their presidential candidate. They win 62 seats in the House, and they are composed of course, we talked about the Southern planters, the planters along the southern coast. In the western states, the grain farmers and the hemp farmers, not marijuana, but there's no indication they weren't smoking it, if you know what I mean. And in the Northeast, they're the remnants of what used to be Puritan America. So if you're familiar with Albion's seat, it's the East Anglians. They also tend to be National Republicans. And then there's 2 other small parties that are worth noting. One of them is the Anti-Masonic Party, which is hilarious that the United States hated Freemasons so much at one point they established a whole party against the Masons. And then there's another they have 25 members of the House of Representatives in 1832. And then there's a small Southern party that are the Nullifiers. And we talked a little bit about what they are. But the reason this is sort of important is so you can kind of get an indication of the people that choose which sides, and it'll become more obvious. In general, if the products that you are dependent on producing, if the entire supply chain and consumption chain for that product was inside the United States, you are generally going to favor the National Republicans and the Henry Clay side. The National Republicans run on a platform of protective external tariffs, which means they're going to they want to charge British bankers, British financiers money to ship things into the United States, which gives American manufacturing a competitive advantage. And they want to use this money to subsidize American production and then also to build internal improvements that link the American markets in more efficient ways. This is an economic system that was devised by Henry Clay called the American system, based kind of on the work of a German economist by the name of Liszt. It's a Liszt.
Yeah. Oh yeah, Frederick Liszt.
Yeah, it's okay. I would get him. Sometimes I'll say Franz Liszt. I'm like, oh, it's the concert pianist.
Yeah, no, we actually we did a couple. We did Frederick Liszt. We did System of Political Economy, and we also paired it with this other book called Free Trade Doesn't Work, which is essentially the same sort of thing but more contemporary.
Okay, so y'all are way deep in the weeds on this. Nobody needs we can skip that part of the talk then, which is good because I think it's the boring one. Well,
I just go back to the fucking anti-Freemason party too. I'm like, I think a good chunk of our scene kind of just wants to start that party again too.
Right, and the other half are the Freemasons. But the first thing in 1832 that's on Jackson's list, and this first is hilarious. He's such a divisive figure that he has a cabinet the way he has a cabinet the way that every president since Jefferson has had one, but he doesn't pay any attention to them. Instead, he has what's called a kitchen cabinet, which they're just his drinking buddies that essentially run the government for him. And
It's just guys being dudes back when you could do that.
quite literally, he's the guy that when he was first elected, they nearly burned down. They got so drunk they nearly burned down the White House the first night they were there. Drank Washington D.C. dry. These are hard drinking, hard fighting Western gentlemen, is what they are. But they get this idea because they don't like banks, and to be fair, I don't like banks either. I don't think anybody really likes banks that much. But they kind of like they're drinking one. They're sitting around the kitchen table in the White House, guzzling whiskey, smoking pot, and doing whatever else it is they do. And they said, we don't like banks. We need to get rid of these banks. And then one of them finally remembered, wait a second, I'm the president of the United States. I'm in a position to do something about this bank, And so he goes to his Treasury Secretary. Who was a man by the name of McLean, and says, we need to do something about this bank. And he decides that what he wants to do to get rid of the bank 4 years ahead of time. Well, actually, really, first of all, before we do that, the reason people want to get rid of the bank is because they perceive it as being corrupt. And to be fair, it is. Okay, the politics of the American state at this point in time are oriented around either national power or state power. And so the anti-bank advocates are generally in favor of kicking federal finances into state banks or private banks that they own. Okay. And the charge they level at the Bank of the United States is that it's corrupt and it doles out favors. Okay. You can see the incongruence here in that both of these statements are true. And so this is essentially a question, not even really a question, an abstract question about the role of a central bank. This is a bunch of smaller bankers that are looking at the big bank that's doling out favors to mostly rich people. And they say, well, we can take that bank over and give all that money to our guys. And the Bank of the United States, which is trying to take the moral high ground, is defending itself in a sort of abstract way. But at a granular level, they're doing exactly what they're being accused of doing, which is giving preferential loan terms to, in exchange for votes. The whole thing is corrupt. But with Jackson in power, this smaller, group of smaller, maybe a little more redneck, maybe a little bit less ethical bankers finds themselves in this position where we can get rid of the bank. And the way they decide to go about doing this was to just empty the Bank of the United States of all its specie at once. And that's all of the gold, all of the silver, and all of the banknotes from reputable European banks. So we're going to move all this stuff into some other place that's definitely not a bank. But you can't do that, because there's a strange rule in the bank's charter that says if the money is safe where it is, then you can't move it. Okay. So Jackson's first Treasury Secretary, who he doesn't like very much, says, no, I'm not doing that. So he fires him and gets a second guy by the name of William Duane. And Jackson goes to him and says, you're going to take all the money in the Bank of the United States. You're move it out. And he says, no, you can't do that. So Jackson fires him. We're two up, two down. The third time, he gets a guy by the name of Roger Taney, who is a fascinating figure. That this is his first real gig on the national stage. For you Catholics out there, he was a Roman Catholic. And we're going to talk about him a little bit more whenever I'm going on Jack Burden's show in a couple of days. And we're going to talk about him a little bit more in his connection with the Dred Scott case, because 20 years later, so whenever he's the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, this is another fun thing about American politics. You could get any job you wanted. You could be the Treasury Secretary, you could be the shoe shiner, and then you could end up being the Supreme Court, Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, your qualifications don't necessarily matter that much. But we're going to talk about him a little bit more in a couple of days. But he's a member of this kitchen cabinet that, Jackson uses to secretly run the country. And he finally decides to make this official and just puts one of these guys in charge of an actual department.
I like that. If you had the courage to be an alcoholic, you could run the country. You could just get appointed. Like, yeah, guess what? You're in charge of all the land now.
That's coming. Okay, that's good. Stick a pin in that, because that's coming as well. Okay, now this guy is, he's still got some problems with the fact that this is illegal. To do this, but he says, okay, well, we're not gonna, okay, Andy, we're not gonna do this the way you wanted to do it, but we will just go ahead and maybe we won't put any new money in the bank. We're gonna slough it off to these groups, and they've come down to us in history as the pet banks. Okay, which means it means exactly what it sounds like it means. These are banks whose owners were politically aligned with Andrew Jackson, which, not always the most reputable people. And so
I will say what it sounded like to me and to many of my audience was banks run by like parrots and cows. Now I know that was a silly thing.
Yeah.
Continue. Sorry.
The first bank of the golden retrievers. But some of them really were that kind of wild in terms of what their stated purpose is and what it is they actually do. But Taney comes up with this idea that we're not going to put any new money in the Bank of the United States. We're going to put this money in these other banks, and then as the debts of as servicing the government's debts slowly start to, empty the national bank of money, we're just going to let it die. All right. This creates problems because of, again, first of all, it starts to create a recession because it badly upsets the credit market. But the thing that it really pisses off the House of Representatives, he doesn't really have a problem with the House of Representatives. Like I said, in the balance of power in the House, Jackson has 143 members of the House, and the competition all combined, if all of the people not in the Jackson party got together and voted, they come up with something less than 100 people. So this is a significant advantage. But he does not have the same advantage in the Senate, where Henry Clay, who is still pissed about not being president, leads a charge to try and censure Andrew Jackson, which is successful. It's the only time in American history a sitting American president has been censured, which really didn't do anything but kind of piss him off. But meanwhile, back at the actual Bank of the United States, it's being run by a man by the name of Nicholas Biddle. It's a funny name, and he's a funny guy, but he is sitting on top of the Bank of the United States in Philadelphia, and he's, over the course of about a year and a half, he starts to see all of his funding, all of his money that he's sitting on top of, dry up, and he's like, well, there's not really anything we can do about this except I can try and engineer a recession so people will despise Andrew Jackson and realize that Andrew Jackson is a fraud, and they can, they'll recharter the Bank of the United States. So he does that. He goes about, moves some zeros around and moves some money around in different places, and he engineers a relatively mild recession in the winter of 1833 into 1834. And this is where the story really starts to hit the fan. And because Nicholas Biddle may have been a pretty competent banker, I don't really know that much about him, but he was a terrible PR guy, and he picked literally the wrong. I mean, it's very difficult to pick a worse person than Andrew Jackson to get in a personal political feud with. I can think off the top of my head 5 people, 4 of whom we've already mentioned, got in personal political feuds with Andrew Jackson, and nobody won. In fact, nobody's career even really survived it. And in a couple of cases, the people themselves didn't survive it. So, so picking a fight with Andrew Jackson's just a bad idea. And really what Biddle ends up doing is inflaming popular sentiment against the Bank of the United States. Now, Jackson comes out and says, Biddle's got too much power, just like I've been saying for years. Look, he caused a recession on purpose. And all of this has the unfortunate net benefit of being true, if you're on the Biddle side of things. And probably the most important thing, probably the most important thing that happens is that, as this money starts to get, and this is where the first lie in the idea of Andrew Jackson as the bank killer starts to emerge. Because one of the things that people who usually hate banking is what are things that people hate about banking? One of them is the fractional reserve banking system, right? Well, yeah. the fractional reserve, there was wrangling over, exactly what the reserve of the Bank of the United States needed to be, to maintain viability, and people were always complaining about it. But whenever this money gets kicked down into these pet banks, and I'm literally, you'll still see this around today. Whenever you see like banks that are referred to as like the Land and Trust Bank or something like that, these are usually the ones some of them are still around. So like it's kind of I think I'm trying to think of one of these banks that's still around. I think the Cotton Planters Bank in the Southeast is still around. The biggest and the most famous of these pet banks was the First Bank of Louisiana, which is they put dicks, they put dicks on their money, but they did, and
why did they do that? Why
dicks is the French word for 10. And so that was their $10 bank. That was their $10.
See, again, bank. You're gonna have to explain all this to me as if I'm a very handsome boy with a gun pointed at you. But I'm going to assume that the penis is on the money, because this whole thing is a black box to me. If you told me they put dicks on the money, I'm like, yeah, I can see it.
They did. It did. It's DIX, But that's if you've heard the phrase Dixie, that's where the phrase Dixie comes from, because Andrew Jackson funneled money out of the Bank of the United States that was like the public, this load of specie that was sitting in this Bank of the United States, collectively gave bargaining power to the government of the United States. So like all this money sitting here in one place is a giant load of collateral that can be deployed at scale in geopolitics to take out loans from the Netherlands and that sort of thing. Well, we're systemically at this point in time, we're systemically emptying that money into the hands of these guys in New Orleans that put dicks on their dollars. It's
never not going to be funny to me. These fucking Nolans men.
But yeah, no, that's where Dixie comes from, because they got this gold. Their banknotes tended to be pretty good, and so whenever they would circulate, the area in which these banknotes circulated came to be called Dixie. But
if I take anything from this talk, I finally know where that name came from.
Yeah,
I had no idea that was it.
That's an esoteric bit, because most people think it's from the Mason-Dixon line, and it's not the case. The money that gets funneled down into these pet banks is immediately deployed in the sketchiest possible fractional reserve banking you can imagine. This is where these banks become known as the fly-by-night banks. We'll outline the scheme here in a second. But the important thing to note for the moment is that, okay, if these banks receive $100 in gold specie from the Andrew Jackson looting the treasury operation. Like, so if they also owned a newspaper and they ran pro-Jackson ads, said, Henry Clay sleeps with his cows, and that's literally the tenor of American politics at this time. Like Henry Clay had carnal knowledge of my mulatto and a barnyard sow. And vote for Jackson. That's literally how it goes down.
That's what we thought we were getting with Trump. We thought that was coming back.
Yeah, it kind of was, and then it didn't. Come on, do Jackson stuff. But what these banks do, if you were lucky enough to be a trusted member of Andrew Jackson's inner circle, you might find yourself with $100,000. I said 100 earlier. You might find yourself with $100,000 worth of gold. Now, normally that would mean you could, under normal circumstances, if you have $100,000 worth of gold, that means you can, fractional reserve banking. We can do a little bit. We do a little fractional reserve banking, and that kind of means you can, you can safely loan like maybe $300,000 out in banknotes, and the chances are that you're never going to need enough of that gold in one place at one time to need to pay off, to need to cover all $300,000 of your.
And for people who don't know the exact terminology, this is where like a run on the bank would come from, and things like that, where not to get too much into the numbers on this. A lot of people kind of know what we're getting at, but just to clarify.
Right. Yeah. Continue. So loaning twice as much money as you have, you're leveraged 2x. If you trade crypto, it's like leverage trading 2x. When these banks get a hold of this money, though, most of them immediately leverage this shit like 200x. So they loan out $200 for every dollar they actually have in gold, and they create this incredible proliferation of banknotes that are being used to purchase land, which is what's the other thing Andrew Jackson's famous for?
Now, if I'm going by the memes, it was, I think he shot every Indian in America in the head.
Well, he didn't. He shot a lot of them. He shot a lot of them personally, and he paid to have a lot more of them shot. But the important thing he did was he took their land. Okay, and when this land gets seized, nobody really knows. There's actually not a provision in the Constitution for what happens when you seize Indians' land, because
and to be clear, it was actually seized, because some people might say, "Oh, what did he or did he not?" But he did.
I mean, there were good reasons to in some cases, because these guys were like they was killing white bitches and that sort of thing. So it's hard to feel bad. I'm not trying to drum up sympathy for the Indians here. Fuck them. But the maybe not,
because a lot of people who will kind of get red pilled or whatever you want to call it, they'll go a bit too far in the direction of, oh, no one ever did anything bad to Indians ever, and it's all made up. But I do think it's important to just establish some shit went down.
Oh yes, shit went down. Trail of Tears, everything, all of that land. The federal government seized it, and they started raffling it off to the highest bidder, because what else are you going to do with it? Frequently and this is where, are you familiar with how powerful the position of land surveyor was in the early United States?
I am not.
Okay,
I only know of it kind of in relation to like the oil and maybe something to do with like railway expansion, but it's
exactly the same relationship. But it's amazing how powerful these guys were. And George Washington, his first job was as a land surveyor. And the reason it's important is because if you're a land surveyor, okay, the United States is taking control of giant chunks of land, huge parcels of land, big, old, giant, floppy parcels of land. And that's from something of huge tracts of land, but
huge veiny tracts of land.
Right. And they're raffling it off for $1.25 an acre, really. But the reason land surveyors are such a good position to be in the community is because you're one of the first people that gets to go see this land. Okay, and the government initially raffles it all off for more or less the same price, and so it gets sold off, and it gets sold off to guess who gets sold off to? Guess who it gets sold off to?
Okay, I got a lot of conflicting scenes in my head. I want to say Rothschilds. Is it the
No,
Rothschilds or is it the Masons?
not the Rothschilds and the Masons. It's but it's these,
is it the Tartarians?
it's these new banks that are printing extravagant amounts of paper money that they can't back up in any way, shape, or form. But the the people who run the government land office are like, oh, money's money. And they'll take bribes, and they'll take, and they'll take all kinds of other, they'll take all kinds, whatever it takes, to pay this guy off to get this huge chunk of land.
I said a quick question. Did land surveyors, accumulating so much power and money, did they kind of carry that forward? Like people say, oh, like the old slave families had a bunch of money and they don't anymore, but were there like land surveyor connections that kind of worked their way into the levers of power?
Well, yeah, no, and they still do. It's the same people, because this is well, let me get this point out real quick. The land surveyors become very powerful because they're frequently the first people to see this land. Okay, this land goes up on auction blind. Okay, you buy a huge chunk of land. You don't know what you got. Maybe you got a vein of gold. Maybe you got the Sahara Desert.
So you don't like storage wars in a lot of ways,
right? It's exactly like storage wars, except for the fact that there is this group of people called land surveyors who have been there and have drawn maps of it. And so, if you've got a good in with a land surveyor, you know which chunks of it to buy and which chunks of it not to buy. But back to to the question that you were asking, the main driver of wealth, especially in the slave economy, was not actually cotton. Okay, cotton is a thing that you do, and this was a fact that it really only dawned on me when I was doing research for my graduate degree, and I was reading plantation manuals, and I was looking, there's the meme about picking cotton, like old Toby out there, we paid $3,000 for him. He could pick all kinds of cotton. Well, actually, okay, when you look at what was actually happening, it's mostly women slaves that were picking cotton. The real money driver in the antebellum South was this land gig, okay? And so land improvement is the number one reason people were employing slave labor at the time. So I don't know if you've ever been to the American South, but I mean, it's a literal jungle. Okay. More overgrown in some cases than, an actual jungle might be. So, what they do is they don't even buy the land. Maybe they know a surveyor. Okay. So they know a surveyor who is, involved with the land broker. And the land broker, if you employ this surveyor, he'll tell you, well, I got a buddy that's got 30 slaves. I can get you a kind of good deal on using his slaves to clear the land that you purchased from me. Otherwise, I'm going to take my business down the road and see if somebody else will. You can see how this kind of works. The chain of grift, and the real use for slave labor in the early part of the antebellum, in the early history of the antebellum South, is actually for renting out gang labor to cut trees down. And so the reason the price of a 22-year-old black male slave was roughly that of in modern terms, roughly that of a Cadillac, was because he could cut trees down all day.
Well, that stands to reason, because if you were to think, like you said, picking cotton, well, that does not seem, except for the duration of time you do it, particularly physically intensive. Yeah, you could have women do it. Why would you need a strapping young man to do that?
Right. So essentially, to get back to the main thread of the story here, what we've got is the United States government under Andrew Jackson has emptied the Bank of the United States of money, dumped it in the hands of these, less than scrupulous, basically payday loan motherfuckers, and also seized the land of Indians and started raffling it off to the payday loan dudes, creating a speculative bubble where some of these banks they're using this funny money that they're printing to purchase land from the United States at about $1.25 an acre, and then they sort through it. They hire a surveyor, they sort through it, find the good stuff, and then they will go turn around and sell that stuff for as much as $100 an acre. Okay, and so that's a like I don't know the math on that, but that's like a 200,000% profit.
I have a question that kind of just branches off from that, but it's related. Is that we agree that the American, it was like the American primeval. It was almost like swamp and jungle, and this land was kind of owned by the natives. Like, did they really have dominion over a lot of this really untamed jungle, or were they just saying that, or? Because I know there's huge parts of America that there were no real Indians out there because there maybe wasn't a lot out there. Like I think the West Coast and California was kind of like that. But what's your read on the situation?
Prior to Jackson, there was the group of 5 tribes that were called the 5 civilized tribes. So it's the Iroquois, the Choctaw, the Cherokee, the Seminole, and I think there's one more. I can't remember, like the Delaware or something like that. There are not as many Indians at this point as there had been in the past because smallpox, booze, it's rough. And they had adopted plantation agriculture in many cases. So in many ways, these people are already these people are westernized slaveholders, and they are like sort of arbitrarily stripped of land. When we're talking about land that was taken from them. The entire state of Mississippi, the entire state of Ohio, the entire state of Michigan.
Oh, so I think that's just for regular, especially people like myself, who when you hear, Indians, you're thinking like the Apaches riding around horses, but these would have been essentially, settlers as well.
Yeah,
the things that we would identify as a colony.
They wore pants and spoke English. Yeah. Okay. If that's what you're going with that. The Apache, Comanche, Blackfoot, the Plains Indians, they're barely even on our radar yet at this point. So you have this situation where these bankers are really inflating a massive speculative bubble, because one of the things that's real interesting about these banks is that they do another thing that is not as anti-banker as people would like to think of the Jackson era, which is we've already pointed out that they're issuing loans frankly fraudulent loans based on the amount of gold that they have. So they have $100,000 worth of gold, and then they loan out $1 million worth of gold in the form of paper banknotes. But they would get their buddies together sometimes, and their buddies would start another bank, and they would loan fake money to their buddies that had a bank, and their buddies that had a bank would loan them fake, deposit fake money with them to even further elevate the amount of money that appears to be in this system, and even further inflate this speculative bubble in land. And there's no national bank whatsoever to act as the backstop here, or as the arbiter of what is and what isn't. Where prior, the Bank of the United States would be able to intervene in a private, would be able to go to a private bank and say, okay, you want us to honor your banknotes that say we have, that say you have this much gold. Show us the gold. Show us the gold. Show us the silver. Show us what you have to back that. There's none. There's no authority left to do this, and so you're left with this situation where not only are these banks issuing fraudulent money, the total amount of paper money in the United States doubles in a year and a half. People talk about a couple of years ago, it was real big. It's like, oh, well, federal government's never printed this much money before. Well, the federal government's never printed this much money before, maybe, but private bankers have artificially created this much money in the past.
That's very, very interesting. I find that fascinating.
And for a man who doesn't like banks, the total number of banks in the United States when Andrew Jackson came to power was 378. Halfway through his term, there are 563 banks in the United States. So the number of banks also almost doubles for a man who doesn't like banks. He's moving the wrong way.
Yeah, on the record, he really wouldn't have anything to say about that, would he? Like, he's not against those banks at all, really, is he?
He's not initially, but the problem becomes glaring very quickly. Like there are people who are they're throwing around what are obviously fraudulent amounts of money, and huge sums of land are changing hands. These are at this point nominally sometimes millions of dollars. This is a lot of money for back in the day. $1 million land transactions are occurring. These are like the land equivalents of like 2 and 3 counties in the state of Arkansas that are changing hands in one land deal, and based on this paper money system. See, people aren't rubes. They are aware that this money is all fraudulent, that there's nothing to back it up. And actually,
that was
really,
my next question. Like, how aware were people that this was happening?
And well, they were virtually every plantation house that you see, exists, and there used to be more of them. That was somebody who was aware of this situation as it was happening. They took advantage of it, and they got out of the market. So like, instead of, this is kind of like what happens with crypto people. You do one land deal and you double your money. You do 2 land deals and you quintuple your money. You do 3 land deals and you bust. Okay, because one of these banks dries up, it can't service its debt. It goes under, and all of their banknotes are, all of the banknotes they issued are worthless, and now you don't have any money. So the people who figured out that how this system works, they did this once or twice, and then they bought a good parcel of land, built a farm on it, built a plantation on it, and then they started growing cotton or sugar or something like that generally it was cotton in this case, and they started selling it to England. So the margin of return on growing cotton was good. It was 3 or 4 times better than it is today. But the actual source of these fortunes that all of these southern aristocratic dynasties are founded on was land speculative grift, empowered in the main by Andrew. Of course, there are also a lot of victims. Like there's people going bust everywhere, and it creates the same sort of problems that you would expect. I don't know if you noticed, but this situation starts to sound very similar to kind of what's going on today. You could definitely see some parallels here. But Jackson,
especially with the government, like someone like Jackson, as sort of like this conservative that is so vehemently against this big central power that he doesn't realize these other creeping decentralized powers are fulfilling essentially the exact same thing, and he didn't see that coming, and he figures out too late.
Right. Well, I mean, and actually, this is a part that I skipped before I talked about the land speculative bubble. Because remember when I talked about the recession of 1834? This is in those wildcat speculators that I was referring to way a long time ago. These are the New York traders. They're generally engaged in the business of shipping cotton into the United Kingdom and then returning with capital goods. During the recession, when Nicholas Biddle successfully created the recession, the way Andrew Jackson and the Democrats won what is called the Bank War is a character by the name of Martin Van Buren, who is in many ways responsible for Andrew Jackson becoming president. He is essentially the representative of these wildcat bankers who had a collection of banking houses and trading houses on a street in New York, all right next to one another. Do you know what the name of the street was?
What is it?
It's Wall Street, and
Oh.
this is where Wall Street comes from. They get together and decide that they're going to essentially bail out this. They're going to save the country by just giving, writing a huge check and bail the United States out of its problems. And so from that point on, nominally Jackson wins the Bankers' War, but in order to win the Bankers' War, he becomes in hoc, very badly in hoc, to these wildcat traders that we refer to. We refer to wild. This is nascent Wall Street, and their Grimawurngtum is this character named Martin Van Buren. But Jackson does start to in 1836 because he's a rube. He's a vindictive rube, but he's not personally. At least, this is where, a couple of people that I talk to about this stuff, they will disagree. I don't think Andrew Jackson was personally a mean. He was definitely a mean-spirited person, but I don't think he was an evil person. I think he was easily manipulated because of his alcoholism and his bigamist wife and his, there are any number of reasons. Like when you're talking about a man with compromat, and like easy ways he's very similar to Trump actually. And it's like, he's a lot like Donald Trump actually, this story sounds familiar, but,
We're stuck with this. This is a simulation, isn't it?
Yeah. He issues something called the Specie Circular in 1836, which is an attempt to curtail this, to rein in inflation, basically. So here's another one of these parallels with today. So now that you've let this inflation run entirely amok, he decides he's going to do something about it. He issues something called the Specie Circular, which states that anyone who wants to do business with the United States, and a reminder, the thing that that they're doing business with in the United States is they're purchasing land, huge tracts of land directly from the government, and then it enters the secondary market where it gets marked up wildly 200, 300, 400, 500, 600, 7,000% in some cases for the very best land. And Jackson issues this circular letter that dictates that anybody who wants to do business with the American government now, they actually have to pay directly in gold. Okay, so this is, okay, we've come up with a way to force people to pony up, to the amount of gold they have. Well, that had pretty much exactly the same effect that the Federal Reserve raising interest rates did on the stock market a couple of months ago, which is to cause a near instantaneous collapse in the land bubble. This poof, gone, because nobody actually has any of this gold that they say they have. They're just trading paper back and forth, which arguably actually maybe could have gone on forever. But because somebody decided to rein it in and, control the inflationary pressure, he popped the whole bubble at once. And, everything, not everything starts crashing down, but a lot of these banks start collapsing. And there's full-blown economic panic, especially on the frontier. Especially among people who were engaged in this, buying and sell this in this land swap or in this, anything that's going on in this ecosystem. So there were some market sectors at the time that were pretty insulated from it. Like if you're like canning sardines in Boston, you may not have any exposure to what's going on out west, but but a lot of people are. And at the same time, he also comes to this is, what does start to happen, though, is that what little bit of gold that banks have starts flowing back into government coffers, and because they do still need this, they do still need to be able to purchase land from the federal government to keep their business going. And so, what little collateral, they called it specie at the time, but we call it's today what we would call collateral. What little collateral they have starts getting sucked back into the federal government. And then on the other side, these these wildcat traders who have been making they've been making quite a killing, because all of these new planters and all of these new plantation owners and all of these new settlers that are moving into the West, they need goods that they can use to build houses and, start farms and that sort of thing with. And because there is a small American manufacturing sector at this point, but it's still actually cheaper to bring this stuff in from Britain. And so they're, on one hand, they're selling cotton into the United into the United Kingdom, and on the other hand, they are on the other hand, they're bringing capital goods back into the United States, and we do have a tariff. It's not as much of a tariff as it had been in the past, but the government is making quite a killing off. There's a very symbiotic relationship between these wildcatters and the federal government at this point. And so virtually all of the gold that exists in the United States at this point in time is being sucked into federal government coffers again, somehow, against, in a lot of ways, it's easy to look at this and think we ended up right back where we started. which is which is possibly true, but Jackson, being the fiscally responsible Tea Party conservative that he is, looks at this situation and he says, well, when he came to power, the United States had a sovereign debt of about $67 million, and he decides he's going to use all of this money that he's got to pay it off. And so, okay, well, who does the United States owe this money to? Well, it turns out it's Great Britain and the Netherlands. And so he absorbs a significant chunk of America's, actual gold currency, gold specie currency, and then pays 67 million of it out to overseas creditors. Now they've got our gold. Okay. And because it doesn't add up to 100%, because there's still gold coming in, and there's still, the British banks, British investors are still, British lenders especially, are still willing to loan money into the United States. And so there is gold coming in, and there's cotton leaving, and this sort of thing. So
I was going to ask you, in your opinion, and this is probably a big question, what do you think should have happened?
Well, ideally, you never actually, this is where I have to make an ideological point, which as a historian, I don't really like to do. But probably the best way to handle this situation would have been to follow Henry Clay's American system, where, instead of deleting your national bank, you use the national bank to invest in an American system of manufacturing, an American system of infrastructure. And the infrastructure is real important, because there aren't a lot of roads to get from one place to another. So if you're growing corn in Ohio, you don't have a way to sell it to people in Georgia. You got to sell it. So, but if we use government money to build a road, and then we can sort of additively, we can use the Bank of the United States to either issue loans, or to get the fact that we have all this collateral in one place, to get a really good deal on a loan from Russia, or from a bank in a bank in the UK. Barings is one that was used pretty frequently. The Rothschilds is one that was used pretty frequently. We could get a much better deal on a much larger loan, and then piece it out, because we can essentially deploy economy of scale overseas, then come back here and sort of piece it out, so that everybody that's involved. So, like, instead of cotton planters needing to go to British, needing to go to New York bankers to get a loan to plant cotton next year, And then the New York bankers, in order to finance the cotton planters loan, have to go get a loan from a British bank. We could have a situation where the Bank of the United States, as the central bank itself, goes to the Netherlands. We did a lot of business with the Netherlands. That's why I keep bringing them up. They go
Yeah.
to the they go to the Netherlands and say, okay, we want a loan. We want a loan of $10 million, and we're good for it, so we'll pay it back to you over 30 years at a 1.2% interest rate. And that, they probably, and that is considerably better for everyone than 1 million 1 million cotton planters going to get 1 million loans from the Barings Bank of London, and each getting a 5.5% interest rate on their
Yeah.
loan.
So just to summarize it for people, it seems that a lot of the opposition to a central bank, might be, well enough founded, but uh, absent the central bank, the exact same things that people don't like about the central bank seem to have happened anyway, and an increased probability of foreign interest being involved and not being able to even behave in any sort of nationalistic way, which is what a lot of people, even if we want to be very, very broad stroked about this, a lot of people are just nationalists. Now, however that delineates over time, whatever. But from a nationalist perspective, the one thing you'd want these banks to do, they can't do in this situation. I think is was that fair?
Yeah, no, it's exactly the point. But back to the story real quick. We're actually getting pretty near the end. Jackson does manage to pay off most of the national debt, but then there's this problem. Okay, now money is still coming in. What do you do with the money now that the federal government now that the federal government's in the black? They don't owe any money. In fact, they're making money now. What do you do with it? And it turns out we didn't have a plan at all until Henry Clay steps back in and says, "All right, well, what we're going to do is we're going to chop this money up, and since we don't have a bank anymore, we're just going to give it straight to the states that did frequently still have banks that were operating. They may have been a little bit nepotistic in the way they operated, but they're not anywhere like Mama and Papa's payday loan service." Okay. And so they cut this money off to federal banks. The first three installments of planned four installments of this national bank surplus, of this national surplus, does arrive more or less on time, but the fourth one doesn't. And the reason the fourth one doesn't is because things are happening on the others. This is why, again, this is number one reason why you don't want too many people in your country in hock to financiers in other countries, because the Bank of England has had a kind of a rough 30 or 40 years. If you're not familiar with the way British history played out over the course of the early 19th century, they lost their American colonies and then spent all of the rest of their money fighting Napoleon. And it took them quite a long time to come out of that hole. They're in another hole right now, and they kind of suddenly realize they're in a hole. So what they're actually doing, and the source of almost all of this gold that's flowing into America via the wildcat traders, is that the Bank of England is loaning, because the Bank of England is a real national bank. The Bank of England is doing exactly this thing that we just laid out, that the Bank of America, Bank of the United States could have been doing. And they're loaning money directly to Barings and to the Rothschilds and to a bunch of other smaller banks that are, like niche trade banks and this sort of thing. And that's the source of the money that's coming into. So the Bank of England is loaning gold to Barings Bank, and Barings Bank is loaning it at a slightly steeper interest rate than they got it for into the United States. But the British decide that they're overstretched and they need to start calling in some of their gold specie now. And what they end up doing here is they raise their interest rates about the same amount as Jerome Powell has over the course of the last 5 or 6 months, about a little over 1%, that could be a cataclysmic move in the very fine differential game of banking and interest rates over the course of 30, 40-year loans. And this this is where there's a kind of a question of whether or not they knew about the specie circular that Andrew Jackson had ordered. Some historians believe that the information lag between 1836 in the United States and 1837 in England was such that the president of the United States could issue an official monetary policy document that somehow the Bank of England just didn't hear about. I think that sounds like horse shit. I mean, I think there's a lot of. What I think happens here is that the Bank of England is aware that the United States government is currently draining its people of their specie currency in order to pay off its own debt, and they decide to go in for the kill shot. But what they do is they start calling in loans. They raise interest rates and they start calling in their loans to Americans who have their bleeding gold specie into the United States government at this point to help Jackson pay off the national debt. And now they're getting bled the other way too. Okay, and they simply don't have the gold to cover it. And the resulting shock takes out the rest of the banks in the United States, more or less. I think there's 6 banks in the entire United out of that. So we started with 378, went up to 363, and I think it's either 6 or 9 banks in the United States survive the monetary collapse that occurs beginning in May of 1837. And this is all more or less the result of your financial policy being predicated on the whimsies of a foreign government. But the resulting cataclysm wipes out most of the planting class in the South. It wipes out a significant chunk of the New England maritime traders. And the most significant consequence is that in an effort to liquidate their collateral and pay off their loans, almost all of the established wealth in the United States is sucked out overnight. So now even the people who are able to keep their land, now in order to plant crops the next year, they have to go to English banks because we don't have a Bank of the United States. They have to go to English banks again with their hat in hand and get whatever kind of deal they could. And if they don't have, because there's almost no gold left in the country at this point, they end up having to collateralize other stuff that they have. And at first, cotton was able to be collateralized because cotton was, they called it white gold for a reason. And so you could get a not terrible deal in like loaning, getting a lien on your cotton crop or something like that. But the proliferation of cotton planters, because the land bubble has popped, so now everybody's trying to grow cotton. The supply of cotton also correspondingly increases faster than British textile mills can process it into cloth for export to the rest of the world. And so the value of cotton starts wobbling quite a bit seasonally, and that makes lenders no longer as willing to consider it to be safe collateral. And people start casting around looking for things they can potentially put up as collateral for loans. And the land's no good. The cotton's no good. What else do you have?
I want to say a bunch of dumb things. I'm going to say women. I'm going to say
women.
Crocodile shoes.
Crocodile shoes.
What else?
Women's closer, because women is one of them. They have slaves.
Okay, I was
And
gonna say slaves. I'm like, I don't know if that's right, but I was.
yeah, and that's this is essentially what happened. So whenever you get to the slavery debate, prior to the 1830s, there is not much of a consensus on whether or not we need to continually breed black people to work on our farms. Like, in fact, the most educated members of, and pretty much all up and down the economic column, there's a consensus that we need to do something about this slavery thing, because they're breeding very quickly, and they're doing very well, and we can't continue. South Carolina at this point is minority white.
So right now
Louisiana,
we have a lot of slaves and nowhere to put them is the
right?
issue
Yeah,
too.
right. Exactly. So this is when the era of colonization societies. Let's send them to Liberia and that sort of thing. But when they become the only thing that British banks are willing to collateralize for loans, then slaves become very important, not as a source of labor, but as a source of financial collateral.
So they're just capital at this point.
They're just capital at this point, and the ideological importance of them to the people who are collateralizing them increases drastically. So at the very same time, you get a group of these people called these abolitionists in the North, that have frankly a number of very good arguments about why these people shouldn't be held in bondage. We're not sure. They don't have a really good idea about what to do with them, but it's hard to get around the morality of holding people in bondage as chattel slaves, and at best it's not desirable. And at the very moment whenever there becomes a rabid movement for the abolition of slavery, there becomes a very real, for the first time in a long time, very strong incentive for slave owners to really want to keep their slaves. And over the course of the next 30 years, between 20 years really, between 1840 and 1850, the demand for slaves increases drastically, despite the fact that technological advances and the availability of free white labor increases such to the extent that using slaves on your farm actually cost more than it would have cost to pay free white labor to do the same work.
Which is also something that, if people want to know more about that, I'm not sure what your feelings are about this, but I know Jim Goad had a book, the Redneck Manifesto, which goes into the relationship between, slaves and then the white people at the time, who were essentially either cheap as slaves or sometimes seen as worse. Anyway, sorry to.
Jim Goad's a cocksucker.
Holy shit!
And I called him that on the air once, but he is right about that. And really, to put a not too fine a point on it, for the stuff that we've been talking about for the last hour and a half or so, what you end up with this situation where that land bubble and that capital goods bubble that are brought about by the destruction of the national bank, it doesn't really go away, but it's foisted onto slaves, and the value of slaves runs away over the course of the next 20 years, as does the scramble to breed slaves. And this is really the first time after this period is the first time you really start to see slave breeding operations as such crop up, because essentially what they're doing is they're being treated like cattle at this point. Because if you have a $2,000 mulatto woman and a $3,000 black man and you breed them, you make if you do it 2 or 3 times, you made $5,000 in black baby collateral. Okay,
we might not be able to quantify this, but if you had to describe the life of a slave at this point versus any time in the past, would it be better or worse or?
Significantly better. Okay, so the treatment of slaves is increasing, but at the same time, the increasingly good treatment of slaves corresponds to white planters increasingly disadvantaging free white labor. Okay, and this is where you get the rise of the Know Nothing Party. These are this is the first time class-based politics enter into the American equation, where because there's this problem where so slaves, skilled labor, industrial labor starts to percolate into the United States, and what would you rather do? Would you rather take this person that you own and send them to blacksmith school? Or would you rather hire the blacksmith from somewhere else in town who can negotiate with you and, play you and your buddy against one another, and negotiate with you? Well, you send the slave. So what happens is there's a spike in skilled slave labor, industrial slave labor, doing essentially jobs that free white people would have rather that they could do. As well as,
they would play them off against the whites as well, the slave owners, to maybe make the slaves feel like they're superior to these, like maybe even lower class whites. Or is that just,
No. I don't think many slave owners were actually doing that, but it is true that from this point on, slave owners they socialize more with their own slaves than they do with other white people, and to the poorer free whites, especially since there's also this mass movement of consolidation of because the people who survived the Panic of 1837 went and bought out. It's vulture capitalism. They went and bought out the people who didn't. Okay, so now there's fewer planters. So whereas before in a county in Mississippi, there might have been 37 plantations owned by 35 people. Now there are 42 plantations owned by 5 people, and there's a massive underclass of white people that are they may not be out of land, but they're not as landed as they used to be. The market for cotton's not as good as it used to be, and they don't have slaves, so they can't get a loan from England, to expand their operation. Okay, because they don't have anything to put up as collateral. And to those people,
as a branch off here, like what I do find fascinating is that a lot of people's conceptualization of economics at this time would probably be very reductive. Like a lot of people would view the relationship of slaves as like almost a Marxist labor theory of value. But even back then, you have a very abstract conceptualization of value and of capital that they're dealing with. That I think would surprise a lot of people to know this is how it worked.
Well, this is when George Fitzhugh is talking about how great it is to be a slave. This is the situation he's referring to. He's like, "Oh yeah, we'll get you set up. You'll be a blacksmith. Everything gonna be all right. You don't have to worry about finances. You don't have to worry about getting a loan from England. You don't have to worry about the things that free white people do. In fact, maybe those free white people would be better off as slaves as well.
We got to deal with the British. You don't want to deal with the British. Believe me.
Yeah. Right. Yeah, exactly. That's the mindset that sort of erupts. But from the perspective of the recently disadvantaged white population, the demographic that voted for Jackson, the demographic that supported Andrew Jackson more so than any other demographic, this starts to look real bad. Okay. And there is, especially towards the end of the antebellum era, there's a massive growing middle class yeomanry, like lower yeomanry and poor white, animosity towards the planters that had not been there before. And, that's not the real tragedy of the story. The real tragedy of the story is that this financialization of slaves ever really occurred, because this is, it's like one or two steps removed from Andrew Jackson yeeting the National Bank. He functionally caused the Civil War. It's not a stretch to say this. I mean, and really, the arguments about what caused the Civil War have raged for almost 150 years now. And people are always saying states' rights caused the Civil War, slavery caused the Civil War. And I think if it was either of those things, we would know by now. Somebody would have made a definitive argument. But so here we go. This is what I think we just did on Blood Satellite. I think we just solved the question of of how the Civil War started. It was Andrew Jackson yeeting the national bank that created a situation where slavery, where American financial sovereignty passes into the hands of Jewish bankers in Great Britain, and they financialize slavery, astroturfed an abolitionist movement in the North, and convinced their only competition in the entire world for financial supremacy to start shooting each other in a bloody civil war.
Well, also, what I like about this is it's a worldview that kind of makes everyone happy, because some people will complain, especially on our side of things, where it's like, oh, you're letting the Rothschilds off the hook. I'm like, no, but this is how it happens.
Yeah.
This is how, and it seems to me that we've never really broken from that fiction, because if you look at one of the defining characteristics for a lot of Americans, I think, but especially a lot of conservative Canadians too, because we are basically an appendage of America at this point. But the identity of America for a lot of Americans is tethered so much to being anti-central bank. And as a result, if you look at the history, as you outlined, it seems that within the DNA of America, from the very beginning, it's had a complicated relationship with foreign interests owning land, assets, and capital. And I don't think it'd be far off to say that's never really changed right up until present day, where we're still hearing news like, wait, who owns the land? Who owns all these skyscrapers? What? It shouldn't be like that. Well, maybe it's always kind of been like that.
It has always been kind of like that, but I mean, this is awfully speculative, and I tend to believe it, and because when you're trying to come up with economic systems that get rid of the banking problem, it's like, well, your problem's actually not necessarily with the central bank. The Federal Reserve's not really a central bank. It's not allowed to do some things that real central banks would be allowed to do. But it seems like to me the problem is the lack of a central bank. And, anybody who trades crypto is familiar with, what's called a stop hunt, which is when the whales in the crypto market or whatever, whenever they crash the price, because everybody that's trading with leverage has a liquidation point. That's the point. If you're trading with 10x leverage, then, where you would normally make $1 on an upward move, you make $10. And where you normally lose $1, you lose $10. But if you get to the point where you lose 100, you only have to, if you're 10x leverage and a 10% down move is a 100% loss for you. You lose all your money. Where does your money go? Your money goes into the pools of liquidity that are wielded by, quote, the whales, i.e. the central, i.e. the bankers and the central bankers. Yeah, well, it could be the central bankers, but the issue, the problem is that in a situation where you don't have a national bank that can intervene directly in the economy to bail people out, which is one thing the Federal Reserve can do, but if you have a situation where you're in hock to these essentially the same people who stand to make money by crashing the price of an asset low enough to wipe you out, so then they can buy, they get all of their money back when you're at the bottom anyway, and then the price just shoots back up. That's that's a situation that it's first of all, it's a national security concern. Second of all, it's the opposite of having anything like a sovereign nation. Yeah. And, the third thing is it makes life unnecessarily difficult for you, and so this is this has been a long convoluted story, and I don't think I've got the smoking gun for why the American system is the system that, that we need to return to. But I do think I have a good case that Andrew Jackson was a dumbass cocksucker, and that the Bank of the United States, the second Bank of the United States in particular, served a positive good that, had it been allowed to run its course, and had we given Henry Clay his chance to run the American system the way he wanted to, we could have possibly, the British certainly seemed to think that this was a threat. We could have superseded Britain in terms of industrial power and as a domestic market for foreign goods 50 years earlier, and we could have skipped the part where we kill a million of one another. We could have skipped the part where we add the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the Constitution, because we now have this giant, recently enslaved but now free population that we feel some obligation to protect from predatory behavior. We could have possibly avoided America's, religious, religious fixation on the issue of race in the 1830s. If it, I don't like to engage in too many, counterfactuals, but in this case, I feel like I'm totally justified in saying that the Civil War would not have the Civil War may have happened, but it wouldn't have happened over slavery.
Now, I have a question for you, first of all, because I know I've kept you for quite some time, and I think you got a pretty full dance card tonight. But I do want to ask you, based on everything we just said, now, like we had just mentioned, the anti-central bank and the opposite of what we are talking about persists in the American psyche, especially with very, very specific politicians. I'm wondering if we were to have you speak to the Tea Partiers, speak to perhaps a Ron Paul, or I don't know if Rand Paul's into this, but Ron Paul, the people who hang their hat on this sort of thing, are they just unaware of this, or they think it's not real, or knowing you, I think I might know your answer, it's some sort of controlled opposition?
Oh, no. Well, I don't. Controlled opposition. You don't have to get. I don't think we do have to get that conspiratorial. I personally kind of think there's a conspiratorial aspect of it. At work. The problem is that there's something called ideology, and that people are not given to rational thought. Look, I'm from the South, and a number of my very good friends are hardcore Southern, I guess you'd call them identitarians. We are very wedded to our own cultural traditions, and rightly so, because the Southern people are the greatest people in the United States, if not the world. But
look, we know my 5-year plan to become Cajun, so I'm with you.
Yeah, but there is a tendency to, because of a historical focus on slavery, there'll be a tendency that, well, we feel like we need to defend that practice as well. And because Andrew Jackson is perceived as a great Southerner and the great anti-banking Southerner, we tell ourselves this story over and over and over until it becomes something we're so invested in that giving it up feels like giving up a piece of themselves. Now I stand before you today as somebody who gave it up, and I feel a great deal better than I did before.
Yeah, well, I see this quite a bit, even in popular culture, that the Southern people of the United States are very proud and a very distinct identity, especially on the world stage even. But I do see them wrestling with things in different ways. Like even one of my favorite hip-hop artist by the name of Yellow Wolf. He's a Southern guy, and he, Confederate flag all over the place, and he's trying in his own way to redeem it by, it's like, oh, that race has nothing to do with it, and states' rights, and that's like the one fork of the road. And then the other one is, but this is one I don't think I've heard before.
It hasn't been made in quite some time. It was a popular explanation back in the 1920s, back whenever we had real historians that did real historical work. But in the really hyper politicized environment of the post-war world, especially since the New Left have taken over his historical narrative formation, and economic history has kind of fallen by the wayside. I think a lot of people just aren't. There's a couple of things. First of all, there's groups like I really don't mind taking a shot at these people because I don't like them at all. The Von Mises Institute, takes a lot of young guys that are interested in this sort of thing and pumps them full of like libertarian Ayn Rand objectivism, where it all of a sudden becomes. There's a Ludwig von Mises article out right now that talks about how Martin Van Buren, who's an orchestrator of this whole thing, is the greatest American president because they'll look at this the libertarians will look at this number, and we got 378 banks to 563 banks, and they'll say that's creating jobs. And then whenever it crashes down to 6 banks, they'll say, well, that's when, the Ayn Rand thing happens. It's like the strong survive.
Well, that's why libertarian ideology is so funny, because like even when it's failing, no matter what, it's like everything's going according to plan.
Yeah. Right, exactly. Yeah, it's everything has to fit into this explanation, and the stuff we've talked about for the last hour and a half or so it doesn't fit into an explanation of the world that people are familiar with. And so I think that's the other thing, is I think people just aren't familiar with this aspect of the story anymore. This is whenever I initially introduced it by saying that the bank war is like something that happens between the Declaration of Independence and Juneteenth. This is and this happens to be my historical era that's kind of the one that I hang my coat in. But it's almost forgotten. People don't talk about it anymore. Like there are like 3 or 4 presidents. Have you ever heard of President Franklin Pierce? Have you ever? Like there's whole presidents people don't even know about that happened.
I do, but only because I heard an episode of Matt and Shane's Secret Podcast with Louis C.K. where for like 3 episodes they just went through all like the weird presidents. So but I know like from a comedian describing it sort of thing. So probably not any of the juicy shit.
Right. And before I do want to mention those books again, that because I'm sure somebody's going to listen to this and be like, I need to go check that out. And the books that I mentioned were The Great Triumvirate by H.W. Brands, The Passions of Andrew Jackson by Andrew Burstein, who is one of my professors, and The Age of Jackson by Arthur Schlesinger Jr. If you want to read more about this era and like the kind of the shenanigans that everybody got into, those are good overall depictions of the era.
Well, this is why I love historical literacy and hearing about history, because I know there's a lot of people, especially in the scene we're talking about, who tout themselves as sort of anti-ideology. Now, I wouldn't say I'm anti-ideology, because I think ideology is interesting, but what I think ideology seeks to do is it deals a lot with idealism, and it's a lot of philosophy. It's a lot about talking about the nature of man, and it seeks to have a very kind of symmetrical, simple system with which to pour the world, whereas real life, it's rough. And we talked about Mandelbrot and talked about fractals, about the roughness of existence when you really drill down into it, and you can't really escape that. And if you're trying to craft human systems that do not take into account roughness, those systems are bound to fail in the short term. So anyway, that's why I like to tell people, like, they will hear something like this and say, oh my God, they're trying to confuse us. They're trying to like poke holes in our ideology or whatever it might be, whatever worldview they have. But I'm like, no, like, you need this stuff. Because as we have shown, and as we said on the show many times before, we keep kind of running into these problems, and we really haven't solved some of these basic foundational things yet.
Right. We know people can argue about the importance of history. It's like, what does it matter what Andrew Jackson did or anything like that? But again, it's like, okay, this guy is the basis. This guy is the founding. He's got a founding myth of the American right now. Is Andrew Jackson. I'm like, maybe you need to find a different one. It's not like there's any shortage. There's Teddy Roosevelt's fine. Like, move it up to Teddy Roosevelt. Go back to go back to George Washington. Why this guy? He's entertaining and everything. But if you examine this story, this is like whenever we were talking about doing this show, you said you really like that type of historical story where you've heard it this way, but this is how it really happened. Jackson's a great case of that, and the thing that amazes me is leftists hate him, and leftists hate Andrew Jackson, and they never tell the story this way, which indicates to me, because there's plenty of leftist professors that could tell the story this way, but they don't, and that means that, to me, in my highly suspicious way of thinking, that means they don't want right wingers to learn this side of the story, because they're sort of happy with. They're sort of happy with a right wing that lionizes this man and, continues to advocate for policies that keep them poor.
I've crafted a way to describe this that I think might piss everybody off. I think that's
Got
important.
him.
So I would say Andrew Jackson is like the Malcolm X of white people. And then the MLK would be like Lincoln or something. Like he's the safe one they tell you to like, but no, the people who are kind of edgy, like this other guy. And then we're saying, well, who made me have to choose between these two? This seems like a false dichotomy.
Who's the Marcus Garvey? You know?
Yeah. Well, really, yeah. It's like, but a lot of this feeling is sourced by, I think, millennials. If you're asking millennials, they believe this. I would assume boomers do too, but the prevailing narrative is like Lincoln, Jackson, and then Teddy Roosevelt as like acceptable masculinity. Almost like a Churchill. Like we like him because he drinks and he shoots things, and that's it. It's very like performative, anecdotal stuff.
The back-to-back World War champs crowd.
Yeah,
like that's who you're. And of course, then the I fucking love Hitler crowd has a whole different set of problems that we haven't diagnosed those today.
that should be another episode. We should do a couple of these because I had a fantastic time with this. I think this was not only educational, but it was fun too.
I hope so. I had fun.
I don't get to. I like American history, fascinates me, and Canadian history as well. But really, it will be the history of North America because if we're being honest.
Are you familiar with the Red Ensign podcast from a couple of years ago?
Yes, I've been trying to. I think I had that guy on Twitter for a while, but then he lost his Twitter. But yeah, the Red Ensign, and speaking of which, there's this group in Canada called the Red Tories. They're kind of like they're on the right, but they're way more traditionalist, trying to basically reclaim kind of a Anglo-British sort of identity. But
the Red Tories became they became the progressive conservative party, and then they became Stephen Harper, and how it went, I don't know.
Yeah, I think that the current Red Tories I see, it's like, ensign flag, love the Queen, love God, and it's sort of, I don't know how performative that is, but anyway, in short, I have a whole kind of list of all these great Canadian podcasts that kind of just went away, and I don't know where they went, so I'm trying to track them down.
I did a show with the Red Ensign that was never released because we forgot to hit record. It just never happened again. But I can't remember why I brought that up now though. But yeah, that's a.
I've got it. Well, we'll track him down and try and get it done this time. I think we were talking about the shared North American history.
Oh, yeah, right. Yeah, no, because Canadian history fascinates me, especially the stuff around World War I, because that's actually my other great historical autism is World War I. Like I've gone so far as to query the Canadian government for a list of all their dead people, so I could make autistic graphs of to track the number of dead people, so you can see when how dramatic the Battle of the Somme was. And the Canadians in World War I were they were like the hellfire troops of the empire. Never retreat.
Yeah, well, and that's holds a very high place in Canadian identity, at least for people, conservatives, and even liberals. Like, despite all the progressive nature of them, but they will tell these stories. They'll tell the World War I stories and really hold that close to their heart. So there's still something there.
Even Justin Trudeau, he puts on, because he likes to. Have you ever seen those pictures of him in literal World War I LARP uniform?
Yeah. One of 50 photos of him LARPing. Like later that day, he dressed up as a Sikh or something. It's just. I do have to admire how he is just the Teflon man, because this is, and we've covered this many times before, but it's like he was caught on at least 3 occasions wearing blackface, and when asked how if there's any more out there, he said he couldn't tell you. So it's somewhere between 3 and infinity times he was in blackface, and then he just got away. He just got away. Got elected again.
One of these pictures, he's got his hand on 2 underage girls' asses, and he's wearing blackface. Like, what are you like? You know,
It shows you, not to get all like contemporary politics, but you see that even from our perspective. I'm like, oh, okay, so I guess none of this matters. Like a lot of the identity stuff, a lot, because they interviewed after the news came out. I saw news stories where they're interviewing black people on the street, and they're like, yeah, I don't really care. So I'm like, okay, so when it's your guy, you don't care. We all kind of know that, but I'm like, oh, so this is all just bullshit. This is all, here's a guy, and he could walk in carried by slaves to the next debate and he would be fine. And I'm like, I don't know how to deal with this, because especially conservatives can't deal with it because they're still in the hypocrisy game where it's like, oh, you said one thing, then you did another. I guess you're the real racist. Doesn't matter. None of that. You've been doing that for 15 years. Doesn't matter. So what do you got? Because this guy's apparently invincible politically.
I mean, he's not, but I kind of like him. I hate that I like him. I'm like, damn you, Justin Trudeau. Your father was a communist dictator of Cuba, and you're the most poisonous person alive politically in the entire hat that my country wears. And yet there's something about you that I kind of wish I was you, Justin. You know,
Usually for people in our scene who have checked out of the validity of a lot of mainstream politics, and we do understand politics as such exists, but we kind of know the levers of power elsewhere. So like I would look at someone like Biden and I'm like, I love that Biden is president. Like it doesn't make any fucking sense, but it's funnier than Trump. Trump didn't really make a lot of sense, and we liked that. This makes
Trump
less
was
sense.
funny.
Yeah, Trump.
You thought you wanted Trump standing with the glowing orb in Saudi Arabia, but what you really wanted was Joe Biden falling off a bicycle in front of the camera.
Was Joe Biden's brain melting in front of the United States of America, and no one says anything, and we just watch. We're watching a guy die like really slowly, and it's
so morbid.
It's not even funny when you realize, oh, he doesn't know what's going on. So I'm like, are we laughing, or is it okay to laugh? Are we less people if we laugh? But then I'm like, I like that this is happening because it just, since I don't place value, and I'm like, this is what's on TV now. Justin Trudeau, he's a guy who's on TV, and look at him. He's dressed in an Indian. He's dressed like an Indian woman, and he's doing a dance, and we'll just go there and nod and go, yep, okay. He's sitting with his knees like taped together in a pose that even a woman wouldn't do, and we're there like, yep, I like this. I want more of this. And everyone's just kind of schizophrenic. Everyone in 2022 is 15% schizophrenic, and I'm okay with that because I'm at 38.
Right. I was like, bring it on. You're all stuck in here with me, is how I feel.
Yeah. Good. Let's see where this goes. And everyone's kind of predicting a collapse. And I know we don't need to get into this, but the line I always say on the podcast is, people will say, this could all end tomorrow, and I say, here's what about this? What if it never ends? What if it just gets weirder? And we don't live in The Road by Cormac McCarthy, and we don't live in Mad Max. It just it keeps getting slightly worse, but more surprising. And then you don't get any redemption. You don't get like the fucking money shot of all this coming crashing down. The house of cards doesn't fall down. The cards just start to warp. And then you don't know if you could make it fall if you even tried. And that's kind of just
right.
the way we're talking about, like the banks. It's like, how would you untangle all this? And once you start to realize, like, I don't know where to begin, it's like, okay, now we can talk. Now you're in politics. Now you can be in here in the fucking dark with the rest of us.
Right. I mean, that's another one of those things. The national bank, that sounds like a great idea. Okay, how do you get from Justin Trudeau to a national bank? How do you get from Joe Biden to a competently functioning national bank? I am just an intellect. I am not.
And that is something we do on this show quite a bit, where we try and think where the rubber meets the road. It's like we can talk about this sort of highfalutin, ideological, philosophical stuff, which is good, and people should do it. I got nothing against people who do that, but once you start trying to sit down and say, how do we map this onto how do we chart a course in the future to get to where we want? And if you really understand how things work, you're like, where the fuck do I begin? Like, how many chess moves do I need to do? How many entire chess games do I need to win to get to the chess game I want to play where I can get what I want? Like, we're talking like a multi-generational, like weird stuff you got to do to like course correct. Anyway, I'm sure, you got to get going soon, but that's when you start thinking about this. And there's conversations that we should be having that we're not having. Some people are. And some people are just spinning the wheels with the same old shit we've been talking about for like 50 fucking years. We're still over here trying to like dunk on liberals and say, here's another thing I don't like about liberalism. Okay, we got it.
Right. Yeah. That's that's one of the reasons. That's why I like it. And these kind of shows actually aren't real easy to do. Like I had notes. I made more notes than I did for all of grad school, and to come on and do this show. but they are more rewarding. I think, even though.
There's a lot of opportunity. Like, I look at someone like you, and there's other people in the scene. Like, I see a lot of very, very inquisitive and charismatic minds. Like the way that you can kind of sit down and describe this and make it approachable to regular people. I have to believe that right now there's ideas being discussed in a fairly popular way that hasn't been done before, where it might have only been discussed in academia or kind of away from the public. But I think there's more of these ideas reaching the general public than there had been in the past. Maybe I'm wrong, but I'm just like, there's something exciting about that.
Oh, no, you're exactly right. I did Monroe Doctrine with the Prudentialists the other day. And, like, I think it's like, was it the second or third time I've mentioned him? He's the content creator that I shill shamelessly. and we did the Monroe Doctrine, and afterward I went and looked it up, and this is my favorite thing in the world. This is what keeps me in the podcasting game right here. Is there were 4 long form podcast YouTube videos or whatever on the Monroe Doctrine, and the most popular one at the time was done by Hillsdale College, who were a bunch of like Lincolnite catamites. And you might have to edit that out. I don't think so.
I might call the clip that. Fuck.
But they spent an hour and a half like reading sections of their dissertation, and they got like 700 views or something like that. And like Prude and I went on and we're like, we're just gonna put a picture up and talk about this for 2 hours, and like we like tripled their view count. So like we've got, like, Prude and I have the currently the most viewed video, like long form video on the Monroe Doctrine probably in the world. Like, I love dunking on dorky professors like that. I'm like, well, it's my favorite thing in the world to do.
Well, it's also being in this scene. I always tell people this. It's sort of filters for certain types of personalities, and not to sound too poetic about it, but I always say, people who end up in this political scene are here usually because they want to make the world a better place. It's not for financial gain. It's actually pretty hard to do this. You can get doxxed, you can get threatened. Like, there's a lot that can go wrong in your life if you're playing around in these waters. So it tends to sort for like certain people who have the wherewithal and it's sort of like a bit of an edge and a bit of a grit about them. So and then those people tend to be better in front of a microphone too. So yeah, you can get on, you can riff. A lot of these professors can't fucking riff. They can barely handle a raised hand in class. Like, fuck off. They don't know how to really entertain a crowd, So there's a lot of opportunity here. Oh, and before we go, if you want to shill anything, the Substack, anything else.
Want me to shill my Substack again? Yeah. You can find me on my Substack is Esoterica Americana. I have not been publishing as much because I've changed jobs, changed cities, did a bunch of other stuff. I have my subscriber count has because I've started doing shows again. It's been a couple of years since I've done shows regularly. My subscriber count has quadrupled since I've last published something. So I'm gonna try and get stuff out. And actually, because I've had so much, because I've been doing like a comeback tour on various people's podcasts and streams. I'm having so much fun with it. I think I may have to cave and make my own soon. So that'll be fun. If you like this kind of stuff, I'm gonna stick mostly to history. If you're familiar with Apostolic Majesty, who does a lot of stuff with European history, try to do that maybe for America. And then I'm on Telegram. Telegram is probably the social media that I use the most, just because I'll like it. I'm on Telegram at Esoterica Americana, and you can find me on Twitter as Christopher Sandbatch. But like Twitter's that's my lowest priority platform that I don't really mess with that much. But go follow me anyway. If enough people follow me, I'll start using it.
Yeah, and similarly, like I'm on Telegram. I think Telegram is probably the best place if you like talking about this stuff. If you like hearing discussions about this and really want to drill down into the details, get on Telegram, join these groups. You can get into conversations with these people. Everyone's fucking accessible. No one's got nowhere else to go. So you can really, I find that I'm learning a lot about American history in various different dimensions just from hanging out in a lot of these sub to the channels, sub to the chats. And then, you'll have fun with it, which is something I remind people of. Twitter isn't fun. Twitter it's a drag, but Telegram is way more fun. It sounds dumb to say, but it actually is quite more fun and enlightening. And you can be part of communities of people who, hey, if you like books, fucking forget about it. You'll get books for free. People just send you shit. Like, here, don't buy it. Like a sucker, like dimes, buying books, like a fucking fanook.
That's what I tell people all the time. But the real cool thing about Telegram is, okay, I mean, I really should say it this way. You can steal movies. You can steal books.
Well, I didn't know how much people are posting full rips of movies. Someone's like, "Oh man, I want to watch The Godfather." Hey, here's the fucking Godfather. Watch it in this chat window. I'm like, oh damn. But yeah, go find you on Telegram. I'm in there, and hey, my co-host who couldn't be here this time, Judas, really wants to be here. He's playing in the fucking street with a hoop with a stick, the son of a hooer. But next time, hopefully, he can come on the interview. Judas is on Telegram too, so everyone come chat with him, harass him. He's highly harassable. But anyway, Mr. Sandbatch, thank you again for coming on, and I hope that we can talk soon.
All right, I'll talk to you later.
All right.
Do not let the rapists win. Listen and love Blood Satellite.